Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Today's guest is Max Boot. We shall chat with Max in just a second, but first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Max Boot. He's a historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst. He is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a weekly columnist for the Washington Post. He just released the critically acclaimed new book, Ronald Reagan, His Life and Legend. His previous biography, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in biography. Max, welcome into the back room.
Great to be here.
So your new book, Reagan, His Life and Legend, is out to really critical acclaim. You got terrific reviews in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's great to see after 10 years of working on this thing.
It took that long.
It took that long. Reagan lived a long time, did a lot of stuff. So it took a while to unravel the Reagan story for sure.
So let's talk about the legend of Ronald Reagan. How has it changed over the years, especially as viewed by both Republicans and Democrats in the age of Donald Trump?
Well, the Reagan legend has kind of evolved over the years. When he was in office, he was a very polarizing president. A lot of Democrats hated him. He was, his tenure was marred by the Iran-Contra scandal, the worst scandal after Watergate. But then, his reputation really ascended in part because of his Alzheimer's diagnosis in 1994. There was a tremendous wave of sympathy for him. And then, of course, but I think even more important was that history seemed to be going his way because, he decried the evil empire. And a few years after he left office, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. So it seemed like he was a very successful president. And by the time he died in 2004, even a lot of Democrats were celebrating him because remember, that was a time when we were mired in a seemingly unwinnable war in Iraq. So people could remember that Reagan, was criticized for, supposedly being a warmonger, but he didn't actually get us into, any lengthy wars, although there were certainly some conflicts on his watch. So I think his reputation, kind of ascended to new heights. But there, in recent years, I would say there's also been some more critical examination of aspects of his legacy that people were not focusing on in the 1980s, like the fact that he largely ignored the AIDS pandemic. It's kind of striking that that is not something that Democrats were attacking him for, and yet in hindsight, it seems kind of inexplicable that tens of thousands of Americans were dying, and he didn't even address this horrible disease until 1987. And of course, he also had a troubling record of playing to white backlash politics that at the time was, considered much more acceptable. That was something that many politicians did. And he did it with coded appeals about law and order and welfare queens and states' rights and other things. That was kind of par for the course of the time. But I think now we're kind of more sensitized about appeals towards, bigotry in any form. And so those are things that I think, count more against them now than they did at the time. And so what I'm really trying to do with this book is it's intended to be neither a hagiography nor a hit job. It's really attempting to tell the story straight in a balanced way that has both the good and the bad. And there is plenty of both. And I think it's important to understand the totality of his record and not just focus on one aspect of it to say he was all good or all bad. Because like most people, like most presidents, he was a complicated mixture of both. And that's really the story that I've tried to tell.
Well, let's continue in that vein for a second, because an important element of your book is your view of Reagan as a pragmatist. Although you do also, as you started to allude before, you draw many parallels to Trump, both as a man and as a politician. What are some of those parallels, as well as the more notable contradictions that define Reagan?
Well, there's certainly huge differences between Reagan and Trump that kind of jump out at you. I mean, remember, Reagan was a guy who was pro-free trade, pro-immigration, signed a bill that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He was pro-NATO. He was very much anti-Russia. I don't think he would be hesitating about supporting Ukraine today. And he also had a very sunny view of America, talking about Morning in America, talking about America as a shining city on a hill. So he certainly would not be denigrating America as this kind of apocalyptic hellscape where everything is going to hell in a handbasket. Uh, I mean, that said, I think despite the differences, you can also kind of see how the Republican Party got from Reagan to Trump. It didn't just come out of nowhere because, there were aspects of Reagan's record that prefigured the kind of things that you see with Trump today. I mean, the obvious similarity, of course, is that they were both hosts of nationally televised TV shows. That's how they projected themselves into politics. And they both played to populist disdain of Washington, even though Reagan didn't call it the deep state, but he was constantly denigrating the very government that he led. And I was just talking a second ago about how Reagan, often as a campaigner catered to white backlash politics as Trump does, far more crudely. And I was talking about how Reagan mishandled and ignored the AIDS pandemic just as Trump in many ways mishandled and ignored the COVID pandemic. So there's some certainly troubling parallels there. But I think the big difference is, and you alluded to this in your question, Reagan was fundamentally a pragmatist when he was in office, even though he indulged in a lot of far-right rhetoric as a campaigner, some of which were very similar to Trump, talking about how Democrats were leading America to communism, all these kinds of accusations. Reagan was making them in the early 1960s. Trump is making them today. The difference is that Reagan in office was much more centrist, pivoted to the center. He raised taxes more often than he cut them. He cut deals with Democrats in both Sacramento and Washington. As governor of California, he signed the most liberal abortion law in the country. As president, he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev, the number one communist in the world, to peacefully end the Cold War. So to me, that's the big difference, is that during his term in office, Trump showed no ability to pivot to the center, no real pragmatism. He really governed the same way that he campaigned, whereas with Reagan, there was much more of a distinction, which I think is why historians rate Reagan pretty highly as a top 10 president, and they're not rating Trump that way.
Mm-hmm. No, just the opposite. He is, I think, the 150 or so presidential historians rank him as the worst president.
Yes, absolutely.
You spent 10 years of your life on this book. Clearly, you did a deep dive. Was there something in particular, or a couple of things in particular, that in writing the book, researching the book, that were just so surprising to you that you learned about Reagan?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really jumped out at me was, the difference and distinction between kind of the public Reagan, who seemed to be a very gregarious, friendly guy who was always, charming everybody that he met, and the private Reagan, who was described to me by people who knew him well as being actually very kind of glacial and reserved, and actually being kind of a hermit, somebody who really never got close to anybody, with the partial exception of Nancy. And that was really something I traced back to his itinerant, very difficult childhood in small town Illinois in the early 20th century, where his father was this alcoholic shoe salesman. The family kept moving around as his dad lost one job after another. And so little Dutch Reagan, as he was then known, really never got close to the other kids. And he knew that he wasn't going to stay in any town for long. He would move on. And so he kind of created this mental fence around him and just kept people at a distance. And what I realized as I got deep into the research is that he used this stockpile of stories and jokes and anecdotes that he had. And he was a charming raconteur. But he really used that not to get close to people, but to keep people at a safe distance, that he would, tell his jokes, but never really get deep with anybody. And it was really striking to me how he really had no idea what was going on even in his own children's lives. I mean, for example, Michael Reagan recounted in a memoir that he wrote in the 1980s about how he had been molested as a youngster. And that was the first time that Ronald Reagan found out this had happened to his own son. This was complete news to him. He was very much oblivious to the things that were going on in his kids' lives or his aides' lives. And, Jim Baker, who was his first term White House chief of staff and then later his Treasury secretary, said to me, I loved Ronald Reagan, but, we always had to remember that we were basically just the hired hands. And, he could get rid of us tomorrow and not even remember that we were gone. He was very self-sufficient. And so that was fascinating to me to see the differences between the public persona and the private Reagan.
That's really interesting to hear because as someone listening to you, that's not something I understood. In fact, I, like a lot of people, as you stated, saw him as warm, affable, congenial. I assumed he had a million friends. That was the public image that was portrayed.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the most fascinating discoveries I made was discovering who his actual friends were. And it wasn't who you think. He actually, first off, as I was saying, he had almost no friends, essentially. Towards the end of his life, Nancy was by far his closest and really only friend in some ways. But there were a couple of guys that he was close to, and these are guys that almost nobody has ever heard of. A couple of former California state cops named Barney Barnett and Dennis LeBlanc, whom he met because they were part of his protective detail when he was governor of California. And then later they left the state police and basically went to work as ranch hands on his ranch near Santa Barbara. And I talked to Dennis LeBlanc, and it was a fascinating insight because, he was basically closer to Reagan than just about anybody else. In fact, Reagan's longtime secretary told me that she thought that Dennis and Barney were his closest friends. These were like blue collar guys, and they didn't talk politics. They didn't talk highfalutin ideas. They just chopped wood together and they worked on the ranch and talked about family stuff and kind of guy stuff. And that was actually something that Reagan really enjoyed. That was who he wanted to hang out with. Which again runs counter to the image because the image was that he's always hanging out with these, tycoons like the Walter Annenbergs and the Alfred Bloomingdales and all these other very wealthy members of the kitchen cabinet. But that was really Nancy Reagan's social circle. She was really the socialite. Reagan was kind of a loner. He was actually happy just chopping wood with Dennis and Barney and often doing it in complete silence. That's really who he was.
I interviewed Pete Souza a while back, and he obviously had some interesting
Great
observations.
Source, yeah. I talked to him as well.
The dynamic between Nancy and Ron. In your opinion, and through your research.
And by the way, let me just jump in there on Pete Souza. Really interesting because, as you know, he was White House photographer for both Reagan and Obama, and it was really interesting to me because, he compared the two of them. I don't know if this even made it into the book, but just talking to him, talking about how, even though Obama had this reputation for being kind of aloof and standoffish, he was actually much more a regular guy than Reagan. He was a guy who could kick back, watch sports, hang out with the other guys in a much more kind of regular fashion, whereas Reagan was genial, but just very distant, very aloof, not somebody you could ever really feel close to.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, the whole have a beer with thing in politics, you would think Reagan was the guy you could have a beer with, and Obama isn't. And as you're saying, right. It's just the opposite. How influential on Reagan was Nancy, both as a wife on her husband's life and as a first lady on his politics?
Oh, she was hugely influential. First and most importantly, they had a tremendous love affair that never waned over the course of half a century. It's really extraordinary. Not many marriages seem to be as close and fulfilling as theirs was. Even when he was in the White House, and if Nancy was gone for a few days, he would be writing in his diary about how nervous and jittery and upset he was that Nancy wasn't around. He wanted her around all the time, and they were always holding hands. At the Reagan Library, there's boxes full of cards that he sent to her every single Thanksgiving, Easter, Christmas, New Year's, anniversary, Valentine's Day. He was always sending her cards, always telling her how much he loved her. It was a very passionate love match, so much so that even their kids kind of felt left out. They felt like Ron and Nancy were focused on each other, not on them. But Nancy was really important to her husband, not just in providing love and support, although that was hugely important, but she was also a very influential and important advisor and she had a very different temperament from his because his outlook was kind of almost Pollyannish. She was very optimistic, very trusting. He kind of assumed that anybody he met had good intentions, and she kind of assumed the opposite. Mm-hmm. Her view was that, she was very suspicious. She was very nervous, very jittery, constantly worried that somebody was going to take advantage of her and Ronnie. And that was actually a pretty good combination. As one of their aides put it to me, Nancy was kind of the human resources department of Ronald Reagan Inc., that she was the person who often hired and fired on his behalf and kind of did the tough things that he shied away from because he really shied away from confrontation, personal confrontation, and she did not. So that was a hugely valuable role that she played for him.
Mm-hmm. For decades, he was revered by Republicans, worshipped almost, as the great pillar of conservatism. The GOP was his party until 2015. How did it go from the party of, quote, the shining city upon a hill, teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, to the dark dystopian American carnage MAGA hellscape cult it is today?
Yep, that's the great question that hangs over this whole discussion, this whole biography. I mean, I tried to suggest earlier that there's discontinuities, but there's also some continuities. But there's no question that, especially on the issue, while Reagan had, a somewhat troubling record, I think, on civil rights, he had a very positive outlook on immigration, which stands completely at odds with, where today's Republican Party is. I mean, I would just say that, I think that these nativist elements, they were always present within the Republican Party, but it was just not what Reagan emphasized. He had a very different vision, and he won over the Republican Party. And I think, in some ways, I would say both Reagan and Trump are kind of a tribute to the power of personality more than individual positions, because it really, I think, what won over the party in both cases and won over a segment of the country in both cases was that they were very charismatic communicators who had very powerful personalities that appealed to people. And then, I think in some ways it was kind of the personality that came first, and then the policy positions, fell in behind that. So, I mean, I think Trump could conceivably be popular even if he were pro-immigration rather than demonizing immigrants. That just happens to be the way that he chooses to go. So I wouldn't say that most Republicans necessarily in Reagan's day were, pro-immigration. I'm not sure that most Republicans today are anti-immigration. That just happens to be kind of the dominant mindset of the party leadership and the people who fall in behind that. But I think, again, a lot of that is kind of accommodating themselves to the person who happens to be the very, popular leader of the party at the time.
You were a Republican. I've always been a Democrat, so we obviously come from different perspectives. But it's just wild to see how the party, from the leadership to so many of the grassroots folks, have just compromised and have had every one of their ideals co-opted by Donald Trump.
I think that's right. But I think, also looking at it in the kind of broader sweep of history, as I tried to do in this biography, I think the Republican Party has been drifting steadily rightward since at least 1964. Because remember, in 1964, most Republicans in Congress voted for civil rights legislation, but the Republican Party nominated Barry Goldwater, who voted against the civil rights legislation. That was really, I think, the turning point. And of course, Reagan first rose to national prominence as a leading supporter of Barry Goldwater. And I think what's been happening is that basically every generation of Republicans since then has been to the right of the previous generation. So Reagan was to the right of Ford and Nixon rather. And Trump in turn is very much to the right of Ronald Reagan, such that today, if Reagan were still alive, I'm sure he would be being called a rhino and not a real Republican and so forth and so on. But you can still see how the steady progression to the right, has occurred with each Republican leader. I mean, the irony of that, I think, is that today, back when Reagan took office in 1981, Reaganism was seen as moving the party and the country to the right. Today, if the Republican Party adopted Reaganism today, it would be a left turn. It would be a move back to the center. That's how far to the right we've moved.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a phenomenon and fascinating to me. To the point you're making, Reagan obviously was not the king of kumbaya. Lee Atwater, who many credit with being the original king of dirty politics, helped reelect him in '84. So we've talked a little bit about the similarities between Reagan and Trump, but is Reagan partly responsible for paving the road in American politics that ultimately led to Donald Trump?
I think partly. I mean, again, as I was discussing, I think in some of the things that he did with, in particular, I would say with his appeals to white backlash politics, also with his use of what we might call fake facts, because Reagan became addicted to a bunch of spurious quotes by communist leaders, allegedly revealing their supposed plot to take over America by doing things like passing Medicare and Medicaid, again, completely made up by organizations like the John Birch Society. But he repeated those canards over the years, even though they were consistently exposed. So you can kind of argue that inured Republicans to the plethora of falsehoods that emanate from Trump. And, Reagan also kind of demonized the federal government, even when he led it. I mean, he often joked that, the worst words in the English language are, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And, he actually, denigrated government service and further increased public distrust of Washington, which, now has reached, epidemic proportions with very few Americans actually trusting the federal government. That's kind of the atmosphere that allows Trump to make these unhinged attacks on the deep state and all the rest of it. But again, I think at the end of the day, I do think, as I said before, that I think the differences between Reagan and Trump are greater than the similarities, but you can still see how we got from one to the other.
So it's no coincidence that Trump literally stole MAGA, Make America Great Again, from Reagan.
Yeah, that was Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan. Although, again, remember also in the 1980 campaign, one of the things that Reagan was campaigning on was decreasing border barriers with Mexico. He wasn't talking about building a wall. He was talking about creating what would become known as NAFTA, which Trump called the worst deal of all time. So there's some ironies there, but it's not exactly, the same thing either.
Mm. So you were a Republican.
And I mean, the final, I mean, on Make America Great, I mean, if you actually listen to what Ronald Reagan said, according to Ronald Reagan, what made America great was actually immigration. He talked a lot about how immigration was kind of the secret of American success. That's the very opposite of what Trump thinks.
Mm-hmm. So you were a Republican and an admirer of Reagan. You worked for John McCain, Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio. Was there a particular point in time, or even more specifically, a trigger moment when you decided to leave the party?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The trigger moment was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Then very next day, I marched down to the election office in New York and got a form to change my registration from Republican to Independent. And that's a decision I have not regretted ever since. That was really what pushed me out of the party. And I think it actually, was a very painful process where I lost a lot of friends and, huge dislocation in many ways. But I think it was helpful to me as a biographer and as a historian, because I think if I were writing as somebody who identified as a Republican or identified as a Reagan fan, I couldn't really write an objective, dispassionate, definitive account of Ronald Reagan. So, becoming an independent, I think, really allowed me to look at Reagan and his trajectory with kind of a fresh gaze and a more objective assessment that I would have been able to do in the past.
Do you think the GOP could ever get back to the days of Reagan, McCain, Romney, Jack Kemp?
Well, that's a great question.
Alan Simpson, those guys?
Yeah, that's a great question to which there is no good answer. I mean, I think anything can happen if Trump loses. If he loses his, second election in a row, maybe that'll cause some reassessment in Republican ranks. Hard to say. But I think, again, a lot of it really comes down, as I was saying before, a lot of it really comes down to the power of personality, because I really think so much of Trump's political success is based on his performative skills, based on his celebrity, his ability to dazzle audiences. And I guess the question is there somebody down the road who's going to be able to dazzle audiences in the same way that he does? To my mind, you could easily have somebody who's much more moderate in their political views, who might be just as charismatic, might be, just as much of a polished TV performer, but and might, entrance Republicans, but might actually move them back to the center. I mean, I have no idea who that person could possibly be, but, based on the track record of Reagan and Trump, maybe we should be looking at somebody who hosts a national TV show. Maybe that's the pool of candidates we ought to be drawing from.
Oh, God help us. What do you think 50 years from now Reagan's legacy will ultimately be? Will history once again judge or rejudge him long after the Trump era is behind us?
I think there's no question that the judgment is happening. That's part of why I think I was able to write, a pretty objective account of Reagan, because it's been 35 years since he was in office. So I think we're only now kind of gaining the long view, which will, only increase in the course of as time goes on. I think, at the end of the day, presidents, polls of presidential historians have judged Reagan to be a top 10 president, like around 8 or 9 or so. And I think, that's a fair verdict. And based on, even though he had a lot of foibles and faults, a lot of which I talk about in the book, but he had his massive achievements. And I think really two that stand out. The first was reviving the nation's spirits and morale after the troubles and turmoil of the 1970s, after Watergate, Vietnam, stagflation, all these disasters. And he really made America feel good about itself again. Morning in America. That was a real achievement.
Mm-hmm.
And the other achievement, which I think in many ways even more significant, was he peacefully ended the Cold War. He worked with Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War. I mean, that's a conflict that could have resulted in World War III, and it didn't. And a lot of the reason it didn't was because Reagan was very worried about the threat of nuclear Armageddon, and he really thought it was his responsibility to do something to avert it. And during his first term, he kept wanting to meet with the Soviet leader, but as he said, they kept dying on him, so he never had the summit. And then finally, in 1985, Gorbachev comes to power, a younger Soviet leader in his 50s, a real reformer, somebody who really wants to transform the Soviet system. And Reagan was initially skeptical of him, but was won over at the Geneva summit in 1985 and realized that Gorbachev is somebody he could do business with, even though a lot of right-wing Republicans were still very suspicious of him. But Reagan was sold on him, and I think rightly so, and so worked with him to end Cold War tensions. And I think that's a historic achievement.
Yeah, tear down that wall. Those words still give me chills. Let's shift to the current political landscape for a second. What did you take away from this week's debate?
Well, I took away that Kamala Harris is a much more convincing commander-in-chief than Donald Trump, even though Trump has actually been commander-in-chief for 4 years. But, my takeaway was that, here's a guy who on the debate stage had a meltdown when Kamala Harris questioned his crowd size. So, how does he stand up to Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or all these other actual strongmen on the world stage when just, having his political opponent question his crowd size, makes him have a meltdown. It turns him into a tizzy. I think, it was funny because, and it was sad both, but it really illustrated what Vice President Harris was saying about how easily Trump is manipulated by foreign strongmen. And she was showing on the stage right there for everybody to see how easy it is to manipulate him. Of course, she was focusing on triggering him and sending him off into a tizzy, but we also know that any compliments whatsoever have the opposite effect. And it was kind of bizarre that, he was trying to claim that he is such a respected figure on the world stage. And to prove that, he was citing Viktor Orban, who is this guy who is destroying Hungarian democracy while cozying up to Russia and China. And that was kind of the character witness that Trump cited to show that he would be a better world leader than Harris. So it wasn't very convincing, to put it mildly.
Many people believe that Trump's dreadful performance, like President Joe Biden's performance at the first debate, is the proverbial nail in his coffin. Do you agree?
I think it's too soon to say that. Like a lot of political observers, I've written Trump off many times, and every time he's shown this, zombie-like ability to come back from the dead. I honestly never thought that he would survive the beginning of his political campaign in 2015, where he insulted John McCain, saying, "I don't like people who were captured." This is a guy who dodged the draft in Vietnam, insulting one of our greatest war heroes. And then I didn't think he would survive, the grab him by the you-know-what tape, which came out shortly before the election. And he survived that too. And, I didn't think that he would survive, the January 6th insurrection. It never occurred to me that 4 years after January 6th, he could still be the Republican nominee. And yet here he is, seemingly as popular as ever. So, I'd love to write him off and say that Harris has it in the bag, but I just think it's based on the track record. It's just premature to say that.
Mm-hmm. How dangerous would another Trump presidency be?
Hugely dangerous. It's really a terrifying prospect because we saw what he did in office. And even if all that you know about him is that he incited this insurrection and tried to overthrow the outcome of an election, that really goes to the core of our democratic values. We've never had a president do that. That a president who's really revealed himself to be a threat to our democracy. And, in the first term, there were a lot of adults in the room, folks like H.R. McMaster, Jim Mattis, and others who tried to save the world from Donald Trump and tried to contain Trump's worst instincts. So my fear is we're not going to see a lot of those people in the second term because he's already broken with them. And, the Heritage Foundation with Project 2025 and other groups, they've identified kind of the MAGA candidates who will fill the jobs in the government and who will be as conspiratorial and right wing as Trump is. So, and of course the power of the presidency has only been enhanced by the Supreme Court, which has basically given Trump a get out of jail free pass, basically saying it's almost impossible to prosecute him for anything that he does in office, and even giving him a free pass to influence the Justice Department decisions, which basically gives him the leave to use the Justice Department to go after his enemies, as he has vowed to do time and time again. So that's, to my mind, that is an exceedingly dangerous combination. I mean, maybe the checks and balances of our democracy will still hold. I hope they will still hold, but we've never seen them challenged in quite the way they could be if Trump returns to office.
And when you consider what the founding fathers did or didn't do almost 250 years ago, and you see today how the courts react to Trump and the media reacts to Trump and a good part of the electorate reacts to Trump, it's almost like no one ever planned for anyone like Donald Trump, and no one seems to really effectively know what to do with him.
Yeah, I think he's the founding fathers' worst nightmare. I mean, I think they imagined a demagogue like Trump, and they thought that they put in place the checks and balances to keep a person like that in check. But I think that is really being tested in real time, or will be tested in real time if Trump returns to office, because I think what we're realizing is so many of the checks on presidential misbehavior are not actual laws. So much of it is just tradition and the way that things have been done. Like in the past, presidents didn't normally tell the Justice Department what to do, who to prosecute and who not to prosecute. But it's pretty clear that Trump was trying to do that in his first term and will do even more of that in his second term. So, and there's just a huge amount of power that the federal government has, a huge amount of power that the president has, and no president has ever tried to weaponize that power before against his political enemies to the extent that Trump could conceivably do in his second term.
How impactful do you think the Cheney endorsements will be in terms of driving voters to the polls?
Really hard to know. I mean, it is significant that, to have a former Republican vice president saying he's going to vote for a Democrat, that's not something that happens every day. And it's just a reminder of how many prominent Republicans are either supporting Harris or simply not supporting Trump. And even his own former vice president, Mike Pence, says that he is not supporting Trump. So that's a reminder of how many people who are very conservative are nevertheless very alarmed about Trump. Now, is that going to resonate with a huge percentage of voters? I don't know. But in an election this close, and there's every reason to think it will be really close, like the previous several elections were, it doesn't take much to tip the outcome. So it could be 1 or 2% in one of the 7 swing states. That could make all the difference. So I have to think that the Cheney endorsement will certainly help Harris, and all the more so if Liz Cheney goes out there on the campaign trail and makes the case between now and November.
Mm-hmm. What about Taylor Swift? Her impact?
Well, I don't know, but she's got an awful lot of followers. There's a lot of Swifties out there, so don't diss the Swifties. I think that certainly has an impact as well.
That would be sage advice. So my last question, and it's a good segue musically, because people I think know you as a pretty serious guy when they see you on TV, especially, and with your books. So I want to get a little unserious for a second, get a little window into your soul in a way that perhaps no one else has, and music is a great way to do that. So give me your top 5 musical artists of all time.
Oh, man, that is tough. Well, I guess I'm a kind of classic rock guy. Hard to go wrong with the Beatles or Billy Joel or the Clash. There's a whole bunch of others, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty. Again, kind of showing you I'm not exactly cutting edge. You
well,
too.
You and I have the same music tastes. So.
Yeah, that's what I've got on my Spotify for sure.
Well, those are all great musical artists. Max, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Again, the book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. Good luck with that. And I hope you come back and chat with us again sometime.
Great conversation. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Lengyel. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.